and the negative team.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. Then let's get started. My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to announce that I've signed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. That was a quote from Ronald Reagan on one of his radio broadcasts, and thankfully our president has a sense of humor, and he was joking about that. We didn't actually end up bombing the Soviet Union. But what was understood in that section was that the Soviet Union, or Russia, was a threat during the Cold War. Unfortunately, that threat has continued, but now it has moved to the region of Sudan. Now, in the speech, I'll just be highlighting it by answering to the negative team's points and showing you why Sudan should be removed from the state-sponsored terrorism list. So first off, Sudan counters terror. Sudan counters terror. Now, if you notice from team's evidence brought up, it was from an isolated writer. Now, I don't have anything against isolated writers, but when it comes to credibility, you have to be able to measure which is more credible. Which one is more credible, an isolated writer or the State Department? When in conflict, I think the State Department will be more credible. Now, because of that, I'd like to read to you a piece of evidence, a study from the State Department in 2017. It says countering terrorism is today a national security priority for Sudan, and Sudan is a cooperative partner of the United States on counterterrorism. During the past year, the government of Sudan continued to pursue counterterrorism operations alongside regional partners, including operations to directly counter threats to United States interests and personnel in Sudan. Sudan takes seriously the threat posed by ISIS, and in September 2016, the U.S. government acknowledged the government of Sudan's significant efforts to counter ISIS and other terrorist groups and to prevent their movements into and through Sudan. There also were no indications that the Sudanese government tolerated or assisted terrorist organizations within its borders in 2016. As you can see from the State Department study, U.S. government clearly sees that the Sudan not only no longer sponsors terrorism, but they are partners with us in countering terrorism in the region. They have fought off ISIS, they are fighting the Houthi rebels in Yemen along with Saudi Arabia. They are not just not supporting terrorism, but they are fighting terrorism and they are avid partners. So I would ask you to measure the credibility. The negative team has one isolated source saying, yes, they do support terrorism, and we don't even know where the source for this person's information was. And then we have a State Department study saying, no, they don't sponsor terrorism. So as we can see from this, Sudan actually does counter terrorism, and they're valuable partners for the United States. That takes me to my next point that he brought up, of the removal benefits the United States. The removal benefits the United States. Now, under this point, the negative team brought up that the list is merely a political tool. And, well, we have to completely agree with that. All foreign policy is usually a goal to benefit United States' strategic interests. This SST list is a political tool by which the U.S. can advance its interests in Sudan. Now, but how will this removal actually benefit the United States? I'll be highlighting it towards the end of my speech, but right now I'm going to be moving on to the next point about Russian control grows quickly. Russian control grows quickly. Now, under this point, the negative team was saying that nothing is lost even if Russia does get control of Sudan. However, that's not the case. U.S. interests are actually harmed if that takes place. Now, this is from Peter Beaumont, September 11, 2018. It says scrutiny was heightened last month following the murder of 3 Russian journalists in Central African Republic while they were investigating the activities of the controversial Russian military services firm Wagner. But if the Central African Republic had been unusual, with the arrival of some 175 Russian private contractors and military personnel, in addition to the supply of arms, it has also been emblematic of the wider Russian efforts in Africa, catching out even those working there. In January this year, we got word the Russians were training the president's security forces. It went from rumors on social media to a sizable Russian presence at an incredible speed. But perhaps as striking as the presence of military advisors in the Central African Republic has been Russian attempts to build a base in the Horn of Africa. So, as we can see from this piece of evidence, Russia is trying to build a base in the Horn of Africa and Sudan, and that can happen quite quickly. But what's so bad about having a Russian influence in Sudan? We can see this in the next piece of evidence. Russian control, detrimental. Russian control, detrimental. Now, there are 2 main reasons why Russian control is detrimental. The first one is mercenaries reviving conflict. Mercenaries reviving conflict. This is from Daniel Brown, and a reporter and photographer on the military and defense team at Business Insider on April 27, 2018. It says the Wagner Group started getting attention in 2014 when its mercenaries fought alongside Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine before moving to Syria. The Wagner mercenaries were sent to Sudan in a conflict against South Sudan to back up Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's government militarily and hammer out beneficial conditions for the Russian companies. Judge, these Wagner mercenaries are the same mercenaries that have been in Syria and have fought against U.S. troops in Syria because they're backing the President Bashar al-Assad. These are the mercenaries that are trying to stir up war again because with Sudan and South Sudan, a war that has been stopped by the UN and U.S.'s efforts. That is detrimental to U.S. interests because not only does it harm U.S. interests, but it causes war. And as we know, conflict causes other problems, especially as we can see in the Middle East. There have been problems with terrorism because of the conflict and because of the lack of stability in the region. Now, there is my second disadvantage of Russian control being detrimental is that U.S. influence is abolished. U.S. influence is abolished. Now, the negative team brought this up as one of his disadvantages. He's saying we're losing leverage. Now, he obviously thinks that we do have interest in Sudan. That's why, and we do have interest in Sudan. Russia taking control would be bad because we would be losing influence and preference to Russia. See, we have evidence back at the table talking about how the Sudanese feel like they're being teased. The U.S. has sent standards for Sudan saying, if you fulfill these standards, we'll take you off the SST list. Unfortunately, they haven't done that. So that's why Sudan feels teased. We are not fulfilling our obligation, what are the standards that we have put to Sudan. They have fulfilled their standards, but we are not removing them from the SST list. As a result, Russia seems like a much more viable option to Sudan, and because of that, they're turning to Russia, and they will begin to be relying on Russia instead of the U.S. When the U.S. does not have influence in Sudan, it cannot pursue its interests. Without influence, it cannot pursue their interests. But that takes me to the advantages. U.S. leverage sustained. U.S. leverages sustained. In the current system, the SST list proves a barrier in establishing good relations with Sudan. However, if we take away the SST list, we will be able to normalize our relations with Sudan, but leverage will still be maintained even through that. Right now, Sudan's economy is in a disaster. They have 70% inflation rate. Currently, their economy is one of the worst in the world. That's why they need the International Monetary Fund's debt relief. The IMF that enables them to receive debt relief. But they can't receive debt relief right now because they are on the SST list. See, through that, the U.S. can be able to maintain leverage because they can say, yes, you can access this fund. We will give you the reward, but if you revert back to what you've been doing before, back in the 1990s when you're supporting terrorism, then we'll have to put this back on you. But currently, Sudan feels like they're being teased, but by passing the Affirmative plan, we'll be able to see that not only Sudan does counterterrorism, but the removal benefits the United States' interests, and Russian control will be eliminated, and U.S. will have greater control over Sudan. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote for the Affirm team and vote to take Sudan off the state-sponsored terrorism list. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination.